my human beings. Let's take this lesson to lean into understanding guilt. Are you ready? Chronic or frequent guilt feels like having a low-grade virus. You never know when it's going to flare up or how long you're going to be incapacitated, but you know for sure it's going to be a punishing experience. If you've ever been racked with guilt, you know the comparison to a virus is on the mark. Just think about it. When a virus attacks your computer, it corrupts it with errors. Isn't that exactly how you feel when you're guilty? Guilt is associated with fewer physical sensations than other emotions, like fear or anger, but it's hardly a subtle emotion. It's pushy and a bit of a pest. When you feel guilty, it is as if someone is hanging over you, hovering around or gnawing at you from the inside. Guilt is the nag that won't let you forget what you did, the pedal that keeps pressing itself onto your psyche and won't let you move on, the thorn in your side that keeps needling you about what you did wrong. It can be sharp and quick, a knife of an emotion. I need to pay those bills. How could I have spent the day watching TV when I have so much to do? How could I have said such awful things to my brother? Guilt can also worm its way into your soul, take off its shoes, and settle in, robbing you of your self-worth and causing you to feel as if your life is one long apology. Although it may seem like a pathological state, guilt is a tremendously useful and compelling tool whose simple purpose is to teach you right from wrong. Guilt flags behavior that fails to meet your internal standard of self-expectation, what psychology calls an ego ideal. Even though it often feels as if it comes from outside of you, guilt rises from within. It springs from the place that wishes to be perfect, or a good deal closer to it than you will ever be. Guilt arises from what is noblest and finest in you, from the highest aspirations, your purest, most moral self. Guilt tells you that you transgress according to your personal commandments. The capacity to feel guilt helps you monitor your behavior and treat others as you wish to be treated. Without it, you have no sense of right or wrong, and society would be a chaotic free-for-all, more so than it already is. A world without guilt would be like driving on a highway with no red lights or traffic signs. People would zoom around with no restraint or regard for others or for the rules of the road. In a guilt-free society, the end would always justify the means. There'd be no doubts or second thoughts or fairness or justice or decency. They would just fly out the window. Who would want to live in that kind of uncivilized society? Guilt is the mechanism that keeps us in line and enables us to live harmoniously in community. When you stop and step out of bounds you've established, you feel badly and try not to repeat the action because you know that if you do, you will feel guilty all over again. You may not have thought so before, but guilt is a necessity, an essential emotion, a practical way to keep yourself in check. Think of it as an internal ruler that makes sure you measure up to your own standards. People cannot make you feel guilty. Although you may insist that someone made you feel guilty, it's not possible. No one can make another person feel guilt or any other emotion. Emotions arise from within, not without. If humans can make each other feel specific emotions, why wouldn't we make everyone feel great about themselves and go off and play? What you generally mean when you say that someone made you feel guilt or any emotion is that some verbal or nonverbal behavior of theirs stirred up feelings that you did something unacceptable or wrong, and now you feel badly about it. That is, your reaction, conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional, to that person or situation was you didn't measure up to an internal standard or expectation. Notice I said internal. It's your own standard or expectation that causes that feeling. The truth is that you might have a variety of reactions to their guilt tripping other than guilt: repulsion, amusement, rage, curiosity, or none at all. No one causes your emotions. You cause your emotions. You'll only feel guilty if your internal standard and the external one by which you measure yourself are not the same. I don't know if you've ever walked the streets of New York City, but if you have, there's a likelihood you've been approached by someone with a clipboard that asks a question like, "Do you care about animals? Can I talk to you about supporting the Humane Society?" I might sorely wish that I could give every single time. Each request tries to convince me that the right thing to do is to take money out of my pocket and to put it into their pocket. The subtle or not so subtle indication is that if I don't donate to them, I'm doing something wrong. All of them, of course, are trying to whip up my guilt so that I make a donation. If I also feel that I should respond to every request that crosses my path and I should never refuse anyone in need, I won't be able to help but feel guilty. I know that if I give every time, I'm going to end up broke. Someone will have to create a charity for me. If I feel guilty in the circumstance, it's because I didn't live up to my own standard, which is the same as that of the charity that I should give because they're deserving. Let's say that I don't care much about anyone but myself. I could receive hundreds of solicitations and be spared feeling the tiniest bit of guilt. Why? Because my ego ideal would fail to place value on giving to those in need. I might think, let them fend for themselves. No one ever gave me a nickel, so why should I help someone else? Or they'll only waste the money anyway. Or I wish they'd stop being such a nuisance. Without the perception of myself as a kind, charitable person, I have no cost to experience guilt. The point is that guilt can only be produced when a person isn't meeting his or her own personal moral standards. Everyone feels guilty to a greater or lesser extent. Because it arises fairly spontaneously when you fail to meet your own standards, people who have high expectations of themselves suffer more guilt than people who have low expectations of themselves. Perfectionists suffer from practically perpetual guilt. Their self-imposed standards are so unrealistically high that they can't possibly maintain them. Instead of lowering the expectations, though, they strain for the gold ring that will always be out of reach. Selfish, self-centered, self-absorbed people, called narcissists, may rarely suffer authentic guilt because, although they may have ridiculously high expectations of others, their standards of their own behavior are often shockingly low. This doesn't mean you should aspire to being selfish to avoid feeling guilty. Narcissists are far from happy people. Though at times they may appear to feel guilty, What they experience may not spring from a genuine sense of having done wrong, but from a need to manipulate others' feelings and behavior. People with what is called antisocial personality disorder appear to feel minimal, if any, guilt in a situation that would trigger guilt in most people. We used to label such individuals who could commit heinous crimes and exhibit no regret or remorse sociopaths. For them, the end does justify the means. They're fascinating characters in a creepy way when you see them in the movies or on TV, but extraordinarily unsettling and terrifying to be around in real life. It's likely that antisocial personality disorder is written in a person's biology, genetics and biochemistry, their psychology, and their social history. Both narcissists and antisocial individuals lack a capacity for empathy, the ability to put oneself in another's place, which is the cornerstone of guilt. Think of empathy as the key to harmonious community relationships. If you can't imagine how someone feels, you can't imagine his or her or their hurt. And if you can't imagine their hurt, you may neither recognize nor care that you caused it. Fortunately, most of us have functioning conscience, and some of us have too much of a good thing. Guilt has the potential to show up on the scene when you develop a conscience around the age of 5 or 6 years old. If you were a 2-year-old romping around in your living room and you tossed your daddy's brand new Rolex into the fireplace, you won't feel guilty. You'll undoubtedly feel upset when your daddy reprimands you to never, ever do something like that again, but you won't feel guilt because you've yet to develop the internal capacity to know right from wrong. You'll only feel badly because someone you love very much is angry with you. If a 7-year-old with a developing conscience flings daddy's watch into the fire while horsing around, you'll hopefully be aware that you've done something you shouldn't have. There are many physiological changes that your brain undergoes before it reaches maturity in your 20s. For a young child, possessing the psychological structures for what we call a conscience and the ability to feel guilt are major developmental milestones. Although today we have nursery and preschool for toddlers, there was a time when children were not allowed to enter school until they were 5 or 6 years old, precisely because the attainment of a conscience was a prerequisite for them to function appropriately and comparably in a group. It's no accident that formal schooling begins at the time that conscience is forming. The development of a conscience is both a biological and a social phenomenon. Your physiology builds mental and emotional structures in your brain that support a conscience, what some in psychology call a superego. Your parents and caretakers hopefully take advantage of this achievement and teach you right from wrong. They do this in 2 ways. They model behavior by returning a wallet someone has dropped, apologizing for hurting a person's feelings, and telling the truth when they've done something wrong. They also let you know what's right and wrong by how they react to you. They reward or give you positive reinforcement when you do something they believe to be right, and punish or provide negative reinforcement when you do something that they believe to be wrong. They show you how your conscience operates by modeling how theirs works and by giving you the guidance to get you up and running. When you receive reinforcement for telling the truth, being kind to others, taking responsibility for your mistakes, and apologizing when you do something wrong, your conscience is being primed in the hopes that it will work automatically as you grow and mature. Reinforcement works on two levels, the concrete and the emotional. Let's say as a young girl, you pinch your sister and she begins to cry. After explaining that pinching your sister is a hurtful and unacceptable behavior, your parents give you a timeout in your room. The punishment affects you in two ways. You feel unhappy and uncomfortable that you displeased your parents, whom you love, the emotional level, and you're not crazy about being banished to your room either, even for a short period of time, the concrete level. Your younger sibling wants to join in on a touch football game in the backyard. Your older brother and his friends don't want the kid to join. You stand up for the kid, and he plays surprisingly well. Your parents hear about what you did, and they offer to take you to the movies for such a gracious act. Notice how the reward works on two levels. You feel terrific that your parents are proud of you, emotional level, as well as getting to enjoy a movie, the concrete level. There are powerful reinforcers to help you learn right from wrong. Concrete rewards and punishments that elicit negative or positive emotions in you. When all goes well, your parents model moral behavior for you and reinforce it in you, and you receive a clear message of what is right and what is wrong in an age-appropriate way to help you develop your own moral values by encouraging you to grapple with ethical decisions and reflect on your behavior and choices. Emotionally healthy parents recognize that they have to give you guidance and that you must make your own mistakes and live with the consequences of your actions. Often the guilt that is most obvious is when you see how you feel about your actions, when you've let yourself or someone else down. You may learn in childhood to suffer guilt over what you feel, a secondary emotion. If as a teenager you plan to attend a concert with your friends but are coerced into babysitting for your younger brother because your parents want to go out, you might have felt justifiably disappointed and angry. If you express those emotions, even appropriately, and your parents insisted you shouldn't feel that way or try to guilt trip you, you may feel you are a bad person for your feelings. What you learn from their reaction is that there are emotions, in this case disappointment and anger, that are not okay to feel and certainly not acceptable to express. Although your disappointment and anger may be appropriate, you are erroneously instructed that what you feel is wrong, which leads you to believe, also erroneously, that feeling that emotion is wrong. You may understand now that it was your parents who should have felt guilty for keeping you home after promising you that you could go to a concert, but that doesn't change the lesson that's stuck. If your parents regularly chastise you for having negative feelings in response to abridgment of your rights and denial of your needs, you probably learned that rather than feel angry, it was more comfortable to feel guilty. You may have learned that feeling any sort of entitlement to happiness was unacceptable. And now, every time you assert your rights and needs, you feel guilty instead. You can have excessive guilt. You can end up feeling guilt-ridden practically all of the time, which can be incapacitating, and destroy your quality of life. If you feel chronically guilty that you're to blame for most things that go wrong in your life or anyone else's, your conscience is in overdrive. While it's appropriate and healthy to take responsibility for genuine mistakes and failures, it's inappropriate and unhealthy to feel guilt when you have done nothing wrong. You may suffer from chronic, unhealthy guilt if you always say you're sorry, even when it's unwarranted. If you apologize profusely beyond words necessary or appropriate for your transgressions, if you generally assume that you're wrong and the other person is right, or if you consistently berate yourself for real or imagined wrongdoings. Perhaps a hefty dose of religious training while growing up has caused you to mistakenly believe you should be punished for your sins, and that guilt and suffering are a normal and natural way of life. Well, they are not. Somewhere along the line, you may have learned you're responsible for the well-being of others. Maybe you had to look after your brothers and sisters while your parents worked, or perhaps one of your parents was physically or mentally ill, and tending to them was your responsibility. It could be that one or both of your parents suffered from drug abuse or alcoholism, and you were the only responsible person in the household, even at a very young age. Maybe you used to assume things are your fault because your parents had difficulty taking responsibility for their actions and habitually blamed you instead. When you're a little person and they're big and powerful and you're dependent on them, you have little choice but to believe them. Children are perfect scapegoats for parents who refuse to acknowledge their mistakes. Healthy guilt motivates you to reflect on or assess your behavior according to your, hopefully, reasonable moral standards. You can do this prior to or after making a choice. If you're thinking about taking an action, refusing the request to take your friend to the airport at 6 a.m. on your day off, you need to consider whether you'll feel guilty if you say no. If you imagine you will, you might lean towards making the trip, or you may decide that you'll feel just fine suggesting he take an Uber. You may not have a chance to reflect beforehand, but refuse your friend's request and end up thinking about it afterwards. Then you may or may not feel guilty according to a number of factors, including what you've done for him in the past and what he's done for you. The general quality of your friendship, whether there's anyone else who could take him, how badly you want or need to sleep, and so on. When you experience unhealthy guilt, you automatically feel guilty whenever you take care of your own needs and say no to someone else's. You don't take into account whether someone's request is reasonable, appropriate, or fair. You say yes because you're afraid of feeling guilty. Guilt is not meant to function as an automatic response to behavior. If you feel chronic guilt, you've acquired a rotten habit of assuming that you're always wrong and others are always right. Perhaps it's time to consider that other people might be the ones who are behaving badly. The way to use guilt in a healthy manner is to reflect on the situation, and if you determine that you're genuinely at fault, make amends if possible, and then decide how you can do things differently in the future. That's it. Once you use guilt to figure out that you made a mistake and how to correct it, you've reached your stop, and it's time to get off the guilt train. The feeling has served its purpose. There is absolutely no good reason to remain on the train once you realize the errors of your ways. I've seen my clients suffering from chronic and inappropriate guilt and having eating issues having a few things in common. Underlying both is an uncertainty how much is enough. With food, it's being unsure about the right amount to eat to be fit, healthy, and maintain a comfortable weight. With guilt, it's wondering how much to do to be a good person. Both involve seeking a balance between saying yes and no to yourself and others, trusting your own judgment and utilizing effective self-regulation skills. How well you know what is enough depends primarily upon how well your early caretakers reinforced what you felt was right for you. Repeated denials of your authentic emotions erode your self-trust and self-confidence, setting the stage for you now as an adult to doubt yourself. Rather than use intuition and judgment to recognize and monitor what is enough, you use guilt. The only way to overcome guilt and to improve your felt sense of what is enough is to change your beliefs about your ability to recognize efficiency into practicing yes and no in the right balance for you. You need to work on two fronts simultaneously: identifying what is enough and letting go of inappropriate guilt. Try reframing your beliefs about self-trust and self-knowledge. Practice asking yourself what is enough in various situations and refuse to feel guilty as long as you're acting on authentic emotions or body signals. Guilt is also related to how you take care of yourself. Perhaps when you were young, your parents failed to adequately meet your emotional and physical needs for help, for stimulation, guidance, comfort, or pleasure. You might have turned to some sort of detrimental comfort, such as overeating or undereating food, because it made you feel better without generating feelings of guilt and neediness. It was your attempt to take care of yourself the best way you knew how. Sometimes, in these situations, young people would allow themselves to feel naughty because it provoked less guilt than wanting other things. Even today, you rather feel guilty than go after what you really yearn for in life, be it love, attention, affection, time alone, a vacation, or someone to take care of you. If you want to disconnect from your feelings of guilt, you have to find better ways to take care of yourself. You'll also need to refuse to feel guilty the times that you still turn to your ineffective coping and comforting behaviors. This means taking risks to discover what you really need to live a fulfilling life and feeling entitled to all that your heart desires. Remember, you may initially feel guilty when you do something like say yes. You'll have to gently push away your guilt because you're not doing something wrong. You're doing something that's right for you. Some people practice self-abuse behaviors to punish themselves when they're feeling guilty. They believe they don't deserve what they need or want because it's too pleasurable and too nourishing. Please remember that no matter how bad you think you are and how guilty you feel, you always deserve to take care of yourself. Feeling good or bad about yourself has nothing to do with what you need. Your upbringing and early choices may have confused the two, but it's time to separate them for good. When you're feeling guilty, you need to examine whether or not you did something wrong. If you have done something wrong, take it from there and figure out what to do. If not, let the guilt go. If you engage in self-abusive or punishing behaviors, remember that it is merely your misguided attempt to look after yourself and meet your emotional needs. If you were able to do this more effectively, you would. As we go through this module, you will become more skilled at that. The goal is to stop feeling guilty and start caring for yourself more effectively. This lesson covered 2 of the 4 pillars of the Harvest method, my method for coaching. And those are self-trust and self-knowledge. It makes me happy seeing everything come together. Guilt is a really tough emotion, isn't it?